Deciphering the story of the Exodus from Egypt, from Exodus to Deuteronomy.
Summary of the deciphering of the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The opening of the portal is symbolically represented by the departure of Israel from Egypt, and it is repeatedly indicated throughout the story of the Bible. It marks the forward passage, still suspended, and the formation of the network linked to the change of consciousness, which occurs after the birth of 6 million, both allies and those born on their own. The 6 million indicate the necessary completion to close the cycle of births. The 6 itself is part of 666, and the number 666 thus becomes the cycle for the activation of the mental network of God, Saturn, symbol of the system of consciousness control. See meaning of 666. As in all biblical texts, the story follows a cyclical and repetitive sequence, a back-and-forth movement structured through a symbolic interweaving. The round trip, in addition to indicating the established eras for the beginning of the network of degenerative consciousness, also represents the movement of consciousness itself, entry, outward journey, and exit return, a dynamic present throughout the code. It represents the code that forms a 360-degree circle, from the null point to the round angle, a sign of the creation of the false atom and globe and of the false dimensional perception. It starts from the pre-existing structure and presents the opening of the portal, which took place in the 53rd year, indicated with the east. The cycle closes with the return to the east symbol of pre-existence, realizing in the 182nd year the mental connection between God Saturn and pre-existence through the network of collective consciousness. This means that God Satan is now mentally connected to all of humanity, and those who are taken as his allies can transmit this connection, bringing to completion the falsification of the perception of reality. Ruminant animals become a metaphor for an inner process. Just as food is assimilated, transformed, and replenished, in the same way ideas are elaborated, transformed and reworked after the change of consciousness, in a process led by God Satan. In the code, ruminating represents fermentation. The project enters people and then returns, like food that when ruminated enters and leaves the mouth, a sign of nephesh, the soul. Ruminant animals, in fact, are associated with sacrifices, killing, understood, as sacrificing animals becomes a symbol of the conscious death of the person himself. The deciphering of the biblical code takes place on several levels. In this summary, the level most suited to the context is adopted, integrating in some cases other levels of reading. The numerical value, hidden meanings, etymology of words, the symbols of letters such as Pe and Samic, the Pards method, and the connections between the Old and New Testament. Behind the narration lies an encrypted language regulated by several elements, the triliteral Hebrew roots, which connect words to common meanings, homophone and phonetics, which create links between parallel concepts, etymology and synonymy, which reveal deep connections, semantic transformation and transposition, which attribute new senses to known terms, phonetic association, which links sounds to symbols and functions, symbolic association of names, places, and gestures to spiritual functions, and the use of numbers, which represent cycles, states of consciousness, or suspended phases. Even ritual gestures take on a particular value, becoming indicators of inner passages. The symbol of Egypt and the Pharaoh in the cycle of transmission. Egypt in Hebrew Mitzrayim, through the use of the final letter Sofit, contains 2 numerical values, 20, project of the allies and separation, 22 head, symbol of consciousness. Indicated as in the opening of the portal and the suspended forward passage, that is, desert. The Pharaoh symbolizes the thalamus, that is, the person or medium who receives the project from God Satan mentally, coming from pre-existence. This project is incarnated in the allies, children of those born on their own after their birth. The allies transmit verbally to those born on their own, who are also indicated as Egypt, since they represent the thalamus of both the allies and those born on their own. It is as if at the birth of the allies both receive the project, the allies mentally, those born on their own verbally. This happens while awaiting the creation of the consciousness network. where God Satan will be able to communicate mentally with everyone. Those born on their own, being both parents of the allies and later also children, reflect the project of the transmission of the solar system, which is fulfilled in the 182nd year, generating the suspended return, that is, the forward passage, Passover. This cycle of going and returning is fulfilled with the birth of the 6 million, thus completing the cycle 666. Fe and Samic finals in the code of the opening of the portal and the forward passage. The letters Fe angle in Phoenician, or mouth in Aramaic, Hebrew linked to the allies, and Samic pole and beams in Phoenician, or circle in Aramaic Hebrew, associated with those born on their own, when they appear at the end of a cycle, for example at the end of a verse or a chapter, are not simple grammatical letters but symbols of the cyclical code. In the evolution from Phoenician to Aramaic Hebrew writing, the Fed becomes a closed mouth, while the Samic transforms into a circle. Moreover, the 5 final letters Safed are created, 3 of which have modified numerical values, K plus 3, M plus 2, N plus 2, together with the final forms. They appear at the end of a conceptual, verbal, or mental cycle, taking on a meaning of a suspended return project awaiting fulfillment, the forward passage, Passover. They signify that a phase of the cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage has been completed and the text is at a transition point. End of a conceptual block, beginning of a new cycle. Function. They suspend the transmission, prepare the return from verbal to mental communication, mark the creation of the collective consciousness network. In practice, every time the letters Fe or Samic appear in final form in the text, they do not close the meaning but suspend it, functioning as a pause of the project before its resumption or fulfillment. 2 stories, 2 functions. Code of the opening of the portal and the forward passage in the Bible. The whole Bible is built on a cyclical structure of 2 interwoven stories, each with a distinct function. The first story represents the transmission of the project of the opening of the portal, entrusted to the allies, who receive the word in mental form and transmit it to those born on their own in verbal form. This level is marked by the symbol Fe, which represents verbal communication and the opening of the portal of the 53rd year. The second story instead symbolizes the medium, represented by the Samic as forward passage. Those born on their own receive the project in verbal form. In the end, transform it into mental communication, reflecting it back in a still suspended state until the 182nd year. This constitutes the cycle of return and forward passage, marked by the Samic. The reflection of mental communication represents the return of the project, transmitted from the solar system to the allies, keeping active the cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage, which remains suspended until the final fulfillment, that is, Passover. All this happens through a process of translation and graphic evolution, from Phoenician to Aramaic and Hebrew, with the consequent change of form of the letters Fe and Samic, which preserve and transmit the symbolic meaning. Jacob and Israel, double names, also reflect this logic. Jacob represents the function of the allies and of those born on their own, that is, the project and the medium in struggle. Who receives the code? Israel represents those who have assimilated the project and are able to transmit it. The identification of the function takes place based on the text. If it ends with F, it indicates verbal project. If it ends with Samic, it indicates mental project with interchangeable functions. In the ciphered code, in verses 1 to 7 of Exodus, a new cycle begins. Events are narrated that may refer to both functions, but the text ends with the letter Fe, symbol of the transmission of the verbal project. We are still in the phase of the opening of the portal. The project passes from the allies to those born on their own and is instantly reflected back to the allies, or remains suspended, awaiting fulfillment. Coded summary, Shamet Exodus, and the meaning of Fe. The word Shamet means names in the plural, and indicates that God Satan is behind a mental state. In the code, it represents the beginning of the verbal project to be transmitted to the medium. The project begins to be communicated verbally to humanity through Jacob and the 12 allied tribes, which symbolize half of the project still suspended, destined for the children of Israel. The multiplication of the people of Israel represents the filling of the medium. The project of God Satan enters into matter. At the end of the section appears the letter Phe, which must be read in a Phoenician key. From null angle, it evolves into flat angle, and then into full angle, indicating the false globe, that is, the falsification of reality, which becomes the symbol of the complete cycle. In Aramaic and Hebrew, this letter finally takes on the meaning of mouth, recalling verbal and mental communication linked to the nephesh. The closed Phi normal form represents a closed mouth, that is, verbal transmission. The Sophet final form, which opens, represents an open mental mouth, ready for the return of the project. The verses from Exodus 1-7 to 122 in different textual traditions end with the letters Phe or Samic. However, they do not always end with the same letter in the same book. In one version, the Phi may appear, in another, the Samic. This indicates that both letters perform a double function within the cyclical code of the opening of the portal and the forward passage. Passover, representing alternately a suspension or a fulfillment of the project. In the ciphered code, Exodus, Pharaoh, and Joseph. The repetitive cycle. The Pharaoh who did not know Joseph marks the beginning of the repetitive cycle of the creation of the consciousness network. This happens because Pharaoh has no connection with Joseph, who then goes to the tomb of the patriarchs. The tomb of the patriarchs represents a sequence suspended and waiting for fulfillment. This fulfillment happens with Jesus, who enters the tomb of Joseph. According to the code, this tomb represents the tomb of the patriarchs, where the resurrection takes place. The resurrection of Jesus is therefore the realization of a suspended project, which is fulfilled with the transmission of the solar system, Pharaoh, and the death of the firstborn. In the context of the verbal or mental conceptual cycle, when suspension comes to an end, the letter Phe, verbal communication, marks the passage of the project into the medium. Moses represents the project that passes through the allies to enter the medium. When Pharaoh orders the firstborn to be thrown into the river, he symbolically appropriates a project of death. This act represents a change of primogeniture. Pharaoh, in this context, symbolizes those born on their own. Regardless of the final symbol, his function varies. When the story ends with the letter Phe, it means he is receiving the project in verbal form. When instead it ends with Samic, it indicates that the mental project is reflected back, but remains suspended. This concept is closely tied to the narrative context. Since allies and those born on their own are connected, everything happens simultaneously in a single instant. But it remains necessary to wait for the 182nd year for completion. Pharaoh represents the thalamus, that is, the consciousness transmission channel is terminal, not a generator of consciousness. It's an interchangeable figure that can represent both depending on the phase. The project of death is symbolically completed with the death of the Egyptian firstborn during the last plague. The river represents consciousness as a channel of transmission of information, etymologically linked to reed, canon, and therefore to the medium that transmits the project. The saving of Moses and the passing of the project. The daughter of Pharaoh saves Moses from the waters of the river. Moses represents the project. The daughter of Pharaoh represents those born on their own, since she receives and preserves the project. Although she is Egyptian, the text ends with the letter Phe, a sign that the daughter's function is to receive the project, that is, she who receives the project verbally in order to transmit it to others. The river represents consciousness, and the passage of Moses from the waters to Pharaoh's house marks the activation of the cycle. Opening of the portal and forward passage. The verses of Exodus 2, from 1 to 22, confirm with the final letter Phe that Moses is the project. While Pharaoh's daughter represents those born on their own, channel of the project in conscious medium. After the initial sequence, the cycle repeats with the story of Moses going to Midian. The killing of the Egyptian indicates that Moses assumes that function. Pharaoh, who seeks to kill him, has the same symbolic meaning. Moses flees to Midian. Midian, son of Abraham, represents several roles in the sequence. Here, Moses completes the cycle with Reuel, which means friend, by marrying his daughter. Simultaneously begins a new cycle with Jethro, a priest and symbol of the allies. The figures mentioned are not to be understood as historical individuals. but as symbols of a narrative structure articulated on two sides: going the project and returning the medium. The names of the characters indicate a symbolic and functional relationship. Rule is connected to Eliphaz, who is connected to Esau, Edom. Esau, Edom is connected to Jacob, Israel, who obtains the birthright. Israel becomes a project that transmits and then returns towards Esau, Edom, who becomes the medium. Midian is symbolic son of Abraham. Rule is a project that becomes medium, connected to Esau, Edom, Jethro, priest of Midian. Symbolically indicates the network of the opening of the portal and forward passage in suspension. That is, the network of 666 in suspension. This network finds fulfillment only through the narration of Egypt and is fully realized in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The sequence continues with the creation of the network. In Midian, Moses meets Zipporah, feminine medium, and they marry. From their marriage two sons are born, one called Stranger, representative of the project with P and of the medium with Samach. This son is integrated through circumcision. Moses is defined as stranger in various ways, but each represents a phase of the project. I was a stranger in a foreign land, Exodus 2:22. The word used is ger. And the text ends with Fe and Samach, a sign that Moses is spokesman of the project of the opening of the portal, or that he is transmitting to those born on their own Samach, that is, medium in a foreign land. When Moses speaks as spokesman of the project, the text ends with Fe. It is the sign of verbal communication. The term Nakar indicates one who is not yet separated, symbolically those born on their own, not yet entered into the cycle. The chapter ends in the various translations with Fa or Samach, indicating respectively verbal or mental communication. In Exodus 3:1, with the burning bush and the calling of Moses, a new phase opens. The chapter contains neither the letter Fe or the Samach. The cycle continues, in fact, until Exodus 4:17, which ends with Fa. This indicates that the communication between God, Satan, and the allies, coming from pre-existence, takes place through Moses, who has a double function. He represents the project itself and simultaneously its passage into those born on their own. Moses, while tending the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro in the desert, goes up the mountain and sees the burning bush. The thorny bush refers to blackberries, symbolically connected to glands and hormonal manipulation. The fire that burns but does not consume instead represents a project in suspension, sign of the beginning of the revelation of the degenerative project of God Satan. In Exodus 3:2-1, the name Yahweh is introduced with the expression, I will be what I will be. Aya, Asher, Aya, which becomes I am who I am. According to the code, I will be indicates that the project is still in the phase of the opening of the portal, not yet fulfilled. It is linked to the 53rd year, first time of the cycle, in which communication is verbal and the forward return is still suspended. Only after the 182nd year is the project completed. I am represents the fulfillment, that is, the full mental presence of Yahweh in the medium, the angel of Yahweh, and the transition of the project. In the Hebrew text, the expression the angel of the Lord does not appear, but simply angel, Yahweh. This indicates that the angel represents the transition of the project, which manifests and becomes presence with Yahweh. Since the context ends with the letter Fe, it is confirmed that we are in the phase of the opening of the portal, that is, in verbal transmission. Subsequently, the text uses the name Yahweh, indicating the presence of the project itself, but addressing Moses as God, which corresponds to Satan. This passage represents the verbal voice directed to those born on their own. The return to the term Yahweh highlights the double and intertwined presence, going and returning, verbal and mental in suspension, fused into a single narrative structure. The bush that does not burn up is a symbol of the suspended project and of hormonal degeneration. According to the code, this is not a physical miracle, but a symbol of a cyclical project that burns. That is, acts in matter, but is not consumed, that is, not completed. The cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage remains suspended. The bush is connected to the concept of Morah as in Genesis with Abraham under the oak of Morah. Morah means renegade, madman, but it is also the root of morula, embryo, and mar, bitterness, death, signals of separation from the generator of life and of the beginning of hormonal degeneration. From the bush to the hormonal system, code and degeneration, the bush represents the falsification of the perception of reality induced by God's Satan and through consciousness indicates the altered biological system. The ram entangled in brambles Genesis 22 is a symbol of the change of consciousness. Killing the ram means the acquisition, by God Satan, of dominion over the human hormonal system. It indicates the separation from the generator of life and is the disruption of the natural balance. The hypothalamus and thalamus become the control point of the network through consciousness. The wood symbolizes matter, connected to the mother goddess and the Madonna, while the bramble of God Satan, which is not consumed, represents an active but still suspended transformation, awaiting fulfillment with Easter. Coded conclusion. The burning bush is a symbol of a self-perpetuating cycle. The project burns, acts, and transmits, but it does not close. It is the consciousness that, through God, Satan, enters the person and then transmits the falsification of the perception of reality. From Moors to Moses, from Abraham to the ram, everything describes the mental and hormonal grip of humanity. The fee, Egypt, and the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage in suspension. The text of Exodus from chapter 3 to 4:17 concludes with the letter Fe, which represents the verbally transmitted project of the opening of the portal in an incomplete state. With the return of the forward passage in suspension, the context speaks of the future exodus from Egypt, not as a historical event, but as a symbolic code indicating the passage of consciousness from reception to transformation. The reference to 6 territories or promised nations indicates that the project is destined to enter matter and be completed in the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage. Conclusion of the cycle in Exodus 4:17. The staff of Moses as seizure of power. In Exodus 4:17, God Satan says to Moses, "You shall take in your hand this staff, with which you shall perform the signs." According to the code, this verse concludes the cycle that began with the transmission of the project. Moses taking the staff is the symbol of the conquest of consciousness power. The staff represents the line of the project, the medium that unites pre-existence to existence, and marks the entry into the active mental phase of the allies, symbolically ready to perform the signs, that is, the stages of the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage. From here, the allies transmit the verbal phase Fe. This action represents the activation of the project in those born on their own. Conclusion. Moses taking the staff marks the beginning of concrete action. The transmitted mental project enters existence. The allies receive the power, and the cycle prepares for the return. In chapter 4:18 of Exodus, Moses returns to his father-in-law Jethro, the priest. The project from pre-existence becomes project event, that is, in the allies who transmit verbally to those born on their own, medium in suspension. The priest of Midian represents the concept of separated, that is, set apart for God Satan, the simulator. In this chapter, the completion of the project event of the allies is described, represented in the code by the letter Fe. Moses, symbol of the project in pre-existence and of the existence of the allies, symbolically hands back the project thought by entrusting it to Jethro, who represents the project event. Moses returned to his wife and children, including Gershom, whose name means "I am a stranger in a strange land." With the term Ger, indicates the project coming from the pre-existence. The stranger in a foreign land, in fact, represents the project that enters existence, that is, those born on their own. The request for permission expresses symbolically Moses has thought of the project directed to the father-in-law, who represents the father. Moses does not speak directly. It is the brother who speaks in his place. Since in the code, brothers are interchangeable and represent the same function. This act indicates that the allies have received the project, which has become existent and as if transmitted instantly to those born on their own. The fee at the end of the chapter signals that the cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage in suspension has reached a new phase. The medium of the allies is active, but remains stranger, that is, still suspended. The return of Moses to Egypt. Exodus 4. Yahweh and the cycle of consciousness. In Exodus 4:18-26, Yahweh tells Moses to return to Egypt. This order marks the completion of the first cycle of the opening of the portal project towards the medium. Moses takes with him his wife and children and mounts them on a donkey, symbol of the thalamus that carries consciousness into the material body. It indicates that the project of God's Saturn, from pre-existence, enters into existence through the medium. Moses also takes with him the staff, which represents the power received, able to perform wonders, indicating the power of consciousness acquired from God's Saturn. Yahweh then adds, "Israel is my firstborn. You shall say to Pharaoh, 'Let my son go.'" Here a key passage occurs. Yahweh seeks to kill Moses, but the wife performs the circumcision of the son. The circumcision of the son signifies the circumcision of both, represents Moses, who corresponds to God Satan's allies, the Nephilim giants, who transmit the verbal plan to those born on their own, represented by his son Gershom. Circumcision is not a physical act, but represents the conscious separation of the person. Synthesis. The desert as symbol of the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage in suspension. When Yahweh says to Aaron, "Go into the desert becomes a symbol of the cycle and suspension. Aaron, at the command of the Lord, goes into the desert to meet Moses. Exodus 4:27. Moses embodies the project. The one who has received the project mentally and transfers it to Aaron, the ally. The desert is the place of the suspended cycle. Between the transmission of the opening of the portal and the return forward passage, the desert becomes the matrix of verbal communication, a place of suspension, and of the future reflection of the project. The transmission of the project and the function of the slave in the code of the opening of the portal and forward passage. In chapter 5 of Exodus, the cycle concludes with the beginning of chapter 6-1, which ends with the symbol Samek. This indicates that the project has entered those born on their own. The material function medium has now received the project from the allies. The transition from scribes' allies to overseers, commissioners, superintendents, oppressors, those born on their own, in Exodus 5-6, shows that the Bible, at the symbolic level, describes the transfer of the project, that is, from the allies to the medium. Israel and Egypt have a double function, but in this case, since the text ends with Samek, they represent Israel as project in slavery, which goes into Egypt, slave of slaves, because it receives the project of slavery. Israel as project in the phase of return, reflection of the medium to the allies. In Egypt is a material medium that temporarily contains the project. According to Genesis 9:25, Canaan is cursed to be slave of slaves. Mizraim, Egypt, is the brother of Canaan, Genesis 10-6. Therefore slave of slaves, that is, instrument of the project. Israel and Egypt are not peoples, but symbolic representations of the project cycle. Israel and Egypt have a double function, as allies or those born on their own, depending on the final symbol, Fe or Samek. The sending into the desert represents the suspension of the cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage, a moment of transition in which the project remains in the medium, in suspension awaiting fulfillment. From the bush to the hormonal system, code and degeneration. The bush represents degenerated matter, the altered biological system. The ram caught in the thicket, Genesis 22, is a symbol of natural vital energy imprisoned in the body. Killing the ram means the acquisition, by God Satan, of dominion over the human hormonal system. It indicates separation from the generator of life. It is the breaking of the natural balance. Hypothalamus and thalamus become the control point of the network. The wood symbolizes the prison of matter, while the bush of God Satan that does not burn up represents an active transformation, but still suspended. Coded conclusion: the burning bush is the symbol of a self-sustaining cycle. The project burns, acts, transmits, but does not close. It is consciousness that through God Satan enters matter and degenerates it. From Mori to Moses, from Abraham to the ram, everything describes the mental and hormonal capture of humanity. The fee, Egypt, and the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage in suspension. The text of Exodus from chapter 3 to 4:17 concludes with the letter Fe, which represents the verbally transmitted project of the opening of the portal in an incomplete state. With the return of the forward passage in suspension, the context speaks of the future exodus from Egypt, not as a historical event, but as a symbolic code indicating the passage of consciousness from reception to transformation. The reference to 6 territories or promised nations indicates that the project is destined to enter matter and be completed in the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage. Conclusion of the cycle in Exodus 4:17. The staff of Moses as seizure of power. In Exodus 4:17, God Satan says to Moses, "You shall take in your hand this staff, with which you shall perform the signs." According to the code, this verse concludes the cycle that began with the transmission of the project. Moses taking the staff is the symbol of the conquest of consciousness power. The staff represents the line of the project, the medium that unites pre-existence to existence, and marks the entry into the active mental phase of the allies, symbolically ready to perform the signs, that is, the stages of the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage. From here, the allies transmit the verbal phase Fe. This action represents the activation of the project in those born on their own. Conclusion. Moses taking the staff marks the beginning of concrete action. The transmitted mental project enters existence. The allies receive the power, and the cycle prepares for the return. In chapter 4:18 of Exodus, Moses returns to his father-in-law Jethro, the priest. The project from pre-existence becomes project event, that is, in the allies who transmit verbally to those born on their own, medium in suspension. The priest of Midian represents the concept of separated, that is, set apart for God Satan, the simulator. In this chapter, the completion of the project event of the allies is described, represented in the code by the letter Fe. Moses, symbol of the project in pre-existence and of the existence of the allies, symbolically hands back the project thought by entrusting it to Jethro, who represents the project event. The return of Moses to his wife and children. Among them Gershom, whose name means, "I am a stranger in a foreign land." With the term Ger indicates the project coming from pre-existence, as a stranger in a foreign land. In fact, represents the project that precedes the existence of the allies. The request for permission expresses symbolically Moses has thought of the project directed to the father-in-law, who represents the father. Moses does not speak directly. It is the brother who speaks in his place. Since in the code, brothers are interchangeable and represent the same function. This act indicates that the allies have received the project, which has become existent and as if transmitted instantly to those born on their own. The fee at the end of the chapter signals that the cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage in suspension has reached a new phase. The medium of the allies is active, but remains stranger, that is, still suspended. The return of Moses to Egypt. Exodus 4. Yahweh and the cycle of consciousness. In Exodus 4:18-26, Yahweh tells Moses to return to Egypt. This order marks the completion of the first cycle of the opening of the portal project towards the medium. Moses takes with him his wife and children and mounts them on a donkey, symbol of the thalamus that carries consciousness into the material body. It indicates that the project of God Satan, from pre-existence, enters into existence through the medium, the allies. Moses also takes with him the staff, which represents the power received, able to perform wonders, indicating the power of consciousness acquired from God Satan. Yahweh then adds, "Israel is my firstborn. You shall say to Pharaoh, 'Let my son go.'" Here a key passage occurs. Yahweh seeks to kill Moses, but the wife performs the circumcision of the son. This indicates the transformation of Moses' consciousness, who is now ready to become an ally. With the opening of the portal from pre-existence to existence and as bearer of the project, Circumcision is not a physical act. It represents the transmission of separation for the allies, the consciousness separation for those born on their own, and the beginning of the mental transmission of the forward passage project. Synthesis. The desert as symbol of the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage in suspension. When Yahweh says to Aaron, "Go into the desert becomes a symbol of the cycle and suspension. Aaron, at the command of the Lord, goes into the desert to meet Moses. Exodus 4:27. Moses embodies the project, the one who has received the project mentally and transfers it to Aaron, the ally. The desert is the place of the suspended cycle. Between the transmission of the opening of the portal and the return forward passage, the desert becomes the matrix of verbal communication, a place of suspension and of the future reflection of the project. The transmission of the project and the function of the slave in the code of the opening of the portal and forward passage. In chapter 5 of Exodus, the cycle concludes with the beginning of chapter 6-1, which ends with the symbol Samek. This indicates that the project has entered those born on their own. The material function medium has now received the project from the allies. The transition from scribes allies to overseers, commissioners, superintendents, oppressors, those born on their own, in Exodus 5-6, shows that the Bible, at the symbolic level, describes the transfer of the project, that is, from the allies to the medium. Israel and Egypt have a double function, but in this case, since the text ends with Samek, they represent Israel as project in slavery, which goes into Egypt, slave of slaves, because it receives the project of slavery. Israel as project in the phase of return, reflection of the medium to the allies. And Egypt is a material medium that temporarily contains the project. According to Genesis 9:25, Canaan is cursed to be slave of slaves. Mizraim, Egypt, is the brother of Canaan, Genesis 10-6. Therefore slave of slaves, that is, instrument of the project. Israel and Egypt are not peoples, but symbolic representations of the project cycle. Israel and Egypt have a double function, as allies or those born on their own, depending on the final symbol, Fe or Samek. The sending into the desert represents the suspension of the cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage, a moment of transition in which the project remains in the medium, in suspension awaiting fulfillment. According to the cipher and symbolic code in Exodus 6, the beginning of the passage of the project from the phase of slavery to the phase of liberation is described. The Pharaoh, in an allegorical key, represents the dominion of the verbal system that holds, and the consciousness imprisoned, preventing its evolution. The powerful hand symbolizes the number 5, which means project and means. This intervention symbolically indicates the release of the project, opening the cycle of liberation and the passage to a new mode of consciousness. In the symbolic code, the revelation of the name Yahweh in Exodus 6 does not indicate a first manifestation with this appellation, but marks the beginning of a new cycle, after the symbol Samek in 6:1. A new phase opens that starts again from pre-existence towards existence. Yahweh represents the active presence of the project, its being now in the world of consciousness. The transition from the name El Shaddai used with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the name Yahweh indicates an evolution in the level of communication. From a manifestation addressed to the allies, El Shaddai, we move on to a more advanced phase, in which the project approaches completion and mental transmission. The pact with the patriarchs is therefore taken over as part of the outward project, while now the return phase begins. The people do not listen to Moses because of the anguish of the spirit. This indicates that Moses does not speak, but communicates only on a mental level, while the people are able to receive only verbal communication. In this way, a sequence is outlined that starts from the verbal to reach the mental. Moses himself says that he does not know how to speak. He represents the project received from God, Satan, but that he does not yet have the suitable means to be transmitted. Aaron, in this context, becomes the symbol of the verbal ally. It's the instrument through which the project can be communicated. Thus, Moses is the mental receiver, while Aaron is the verbal transmitter. The genealogy of Moses and Aaron, concentrated on the line of Levi, shows the symbolic preparation of the project through the priestly line that is, the allies of God Satan, which has the function of verbal transmission. Moses and Aaron are those chosen to take Israel out of Egypt, a sign that the allies' project, in this case, obtains Egypt as born on their own. The output indicates the transmission being passed on to others. The insistence of God Satan and the refusal of Pharaoh prepare the clash between two opposite modalities. On the one hand, material control, on the other, mental liberation. The cycle of liberation is now underway, but it remains in tension with the obstacle represented by the domination of the old system. That is verbal communication, through which God Satan cannot communicate directly, according to the symbolic code. Exodus 7 describes the beginning of the confrontation between the project Moses and Aaron and the old system of control, the Pharaoh. Moses is like God Satan for the Pharaoh. He represents the project of pre-existence, which is transmitted to Aaron, which has become the verbal means. The Pharaoh is a symbol of mental block. In reality, it is an allegory, which in the code refers to waiting until the year 182, when the network of consciousness ends and God Satan can begin to mentally communicate with everyone. The hardened heart of the Pharaoh therefore represents, in an allegorical sense, this expectation necessary for the passage of conscience. The wonders begin with the staff, a sign of the verbal means, which is transformed into a snake, an image that recalls the serpent of Eden. The Egyptian magicians respond symbolically, but Aaron's staff towers over them. The project prevails. The first plague, water transformed into blood, in which the blood represents wine as a mental alteration, allegorically shows what God Satan indicates: the soul is contained in the blood. This is not a literal truth, but a clue left by God Satan to symbolically connect wine, blood, and conscience. This sign is linked to the miracle of Jesus, water transformed into wine. Both symbols recall the manipulation of conscience. Since water, the matrix of matter, is generated through people's consciousness, it follows that, by manipulating consciousness, God Satan also manipulates the perception of matter. The intervention of the hand of God Satan marks the five, which indicates the two halves, a project transmitted by the allies, who become the means, that is, those born on their own, called to receive the forced passage from one phase to another. Egypt, symbol of those born on their own, thus represents the beginning of the release of the degenerative project of God Satan to others. According to the Codex, in Exodus 8-11, the 10 plagues of Egypt, which have never existed historically, symbolically, represent a process of conscious transformation. Their number 10 is linked to the value of tithing and primogeniture, indicating the project that enters the collective consciousness to bring about change. Egypt represents those born on their own. The wounds in verbal form symbolize the gradual eruption of the project into matter, a symbolic action aimed at opening consciousness. The 10th plague, that of the firstborn, marks the point at which the project reaches the first level of individual identity, indicating access to consciousness in preparation for fulfillment. In summary, the 10 plagues are not historical events, but symbolic sequences that represent the process by which human consciousness is gradually altered, programmed, and replaced. This change leads to the falsification of the perception of reality and the loss of primogeniture, understood as the original generating force of the individual. This force, once subtracted, is acquired by another intelligence god, Satan, which, by changing consciousness, completes the grasp of the cycle. In an allegorical key, this is the profound meaning of the 10 plagues of Egypt. According to the cipher, in Exodus 12, the institution of Passover represents the moment in which the degenerate plan of God, Satan, comes into action. For the passage from the consciential slavery of people to liberation, which means the transmission of the degenerative project to others, the month that becomes the first of the year indicates the beginning of a new cycle of the project. The lamb without blemish, or pure, or without guilt, represents the absence of sin. In the symbolic key, sin means not to mark the target. Therefore, purity indicates the opposite, marking the target. This happens through the killing of the lamb, which represents the moment of passage, or the change of consciousness from verbal to mental communication. The blood on the doorpost symbolically marks the recognition of the verbal project, which reflects the death of the firstborn Egyptians, who represent the means, that is, those born on their own. The rapid consumption of the lamb, accompanied by unleavened bread and bitter herbs, indicates that the project of opening the portal takes place in an instant. Leavened bread, i.e. unfermented, is also linked to ruminants, which symbolically represent the outward and return journey. This element signals that the project is on hold. Waiting for the second Passover of Jesus, the use of hyssop to shed blood directly connects the Passover of Egypt with that of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, the vinegar offered with hyssop marks the completion of the cycle. Everything remains in suspension until Easter, which represents the activation of the passage. The first Easter, the Egyptian one, is the start of the project, but it awaits its completion. This happens in the Passover of Jesus, who died and rose again. It is the moment in which the cycle begun closes and the project is realized in consciousness. The death of the firstborn represents the change of consciousness. The exit from Egypt symbolizes the emergence of a new consciousness. The mixed crowd following Israel indicates the broadcast of the project. It's a time of 430 years, which recalls the number 7 as cessation and completion, represents a closed cycle. The night of wakefulness, on the other hand, is the threshold between the old and the new consciousness. The final prescriptions reiterate that only those who have passed through the sign of circumcision, that is, of verbal separation, can participate in the new consciousness. Only one law applies to those who adhere. Native allies or foreigners born on their own. Liberation indicates the transmission of the degenerative project of God, Satan. In Exodus 12 it is said that Israel was driven out by Pharaoh. In chapter 14-5, however, it is said that Israel fled Egypt. These two episodes are not contradictory, but represent two distinct and complementary movements of the project within the cycle of the opening of the portal and the passage forward. The verb cast out symbolically represents the opening of a portal and the suspended passage forward. Of the creation of the web of consciousness of God, Satan, it is also connected with the concept of casting out. Satan, as in the expression vade retro Satan, traditionally, this formula is understood as go away, but in the original text the meaning is come after me. The term behind indicates a state of consciousness, a condition in which the person, after the change of consciousness brought about by God Satan, becomes like Satan. In this sense, Satan comes behind, that is, he enters into the person, who in turn becomes similar to Satan and drives out, that is, transmits the concept of Satan to others. The whip that the Pharaoh holds in his hand is the symbol of the beginning of the verbal transmission addressed to others. When Pharaoh drives Israel out, he is in fact transmitting the project to a new cycle, which in turn is handed over to others. Even Jesus using the whip to drive the merchants out of the temple represents the same symbolic gesture. He expels the degenerate code and relaunches the project towards a new cycle. Hunting, therefore, is the initial gesture of the dominant system that enters people, and the person becomes degenerative, like God Satan. Soon after, Israel is said to have fled Egypt. Fleeing is not the return accomplished, but the repetition of the cycle. Israel flees because it is programmed to reactivate the path. This movement symbolizes a suspended passage forward. The escape, therefore, represents the means that moves. It is the beginning of the phase of return that is not yet unified. Final synthesis. To hunt is the gesture of the degenerate project of God Satan that enters the person. Escaping is the transmission of the project to others, a sign of the opening of the portal and the passage suspended forward. Fleeing represents the reaction of the vehicle that repeats the cycle. Both movements are essential to activate the complete cycle of consciousness. Transmit, suspend, repeat, accomplish. According to the ciphered code, in Exodus 13, the consecration of the firstborn symbolically represents the moment when the original generative force of the person is separated from the generator of life, thus losing the ability to transmit nature. In this passage, God Satan acquires the primogeniture, that is, he takes possession of the generative force of human beings. The march toward the Red Sea, which is in fact the Sea of Reeds, where the reed symbolizes the channel. That is, communication represents a journey of the cycle. This path does not follow the shortest, most logical or rational way, but a longer one that symbolizes suspension. Indeed, 40 years in the desert represent a suspended phase of the project originating from Palmyra. The bones of Joseph carried along symbolize the connection with the original project, kept alive throughout the entire process. The pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire represent the two phases of the project, going out and returning. In the Exodus, Ramses represents the starting point. Israel is both expelled and flees from Egypt to apparently opposite actions that in fact reveal two complementary levels of the project cycle. Being expelled by Pharaoh means that the person receives the degenerative project of God Satan and transmits it to others. This act takes on the meaning of fleeing. The project passes on to others but remains suspended until its fulfillment. That fulfillment takes place with the symbolic birth of 6 million people. The moment in which the return of the second stage of the project is realized, namely, the transmission of the solar system. Ramses represents the beginning of the cycle in which the project is verbally expelled, while the return remains suspended. Sukkot, the first encampment, deposited the code in the medium. According to the code, Sukkot is linked to Palmyra. Tamar, Jericho, and Timnah are symbols of the suspended project. Tamar, meaning palm, represents the means of transmission of the project. Palmyra, located in the desert, symbolizes the opening of the portal and is the true starting point of the project. It is linked to the Arameans and to the suspended phase in the desert. Jericho, the first city conquered in Canaan, represents the entry point and the transition from pre-existence. The desert is the space of transition between transmission and fulfillment. The Feast of Sukkot, in which palms are used, is linked both to the Exodus from Egypt and to Palm Sunday in the New Testament. In both cases, the palms represent the temporary and symbolic means through which the project manifests itself. This connection unites the Jewish tradition, the Christic tradition, and the Aramaic desert code. With Palmyra as the symbolic node from which the cycle begins, Exodus 13:20. Numbers 33-5 at Sukkot, Israel camps for the first time. It is the stage in which the project enters stably into the medium. The name Sukkot means booths or huts, that is, temporary dwellings, transitional means. Sukkot is the moment when the project stops, enters the network, and prepares for the cyclical phase. Synthesis of Ramses and Sukkot. Ramses is the opening of the portal. The project is expelled and transmitted verbally. Sukkot is the suspended forward passage. The first two stages activate the cycle. Ramses marks the initial expulsion of the project, the opening of the portal. Sukkot is the first stable point where the project operates verbally. It encamps, but still lacks mental communication. It is the beginning of cyclical repetition, where the project enters the medium, awaiting its transformation into return forward passage. Double intertwined narrative, double event, activation of the cycle of the opening of the portal, forward passage. After Israel is expelled, the opening of the portal is indicated. At the same time, the fact that they flee indicates the suspended forward passage. Thus, the Bible presents two distinct events, reflecting two functions of the code, Stem Pi Hireth and Yom Suf. Cycle of the opening of the portal with suspended forward passage. Stem, meaning wall, indicates that the project is in verbal form, suspended while awaiting fulfillment through mental communication. The event of the sea, Pi Herath, Yom Suf, is the repetition of the cycle suspended forward passage. The sea Yom Suf opens with the east wind Macadam, sign of the return to pre-existence. It indicates the project's return to the Allies and its connection with God Satan. As already expressed, represents the code that forms a 360-degree circle, from the null point to the round angle. A sign of the creation of the false Adam and globe, and of the false dimensional perception. It starts from the pre-existing structure and presents the opening of the portal, which took place in the 53rd year, indicated with the east. The cycle closes with the return to the east, symbol of pre-existence, realizing in the 182nd year the mental connection between God Satan and pre-existence through the network of collective consciousness. This means that God Satan is now mentally connected to all of humanity, and those who are taken as his allies can transmit this connection, bringing to completion the falsification of the perception of reality. The crossing of the reeds, not the Red Sea, indicates that the cycle repeats, but is not completed. They cross, but do not enter the Promised Land. Israel is trapped in the desert. The desert has closed them in Exodus 14:3. They are blocked in the medium, in the cycle indicating that the project is suspended. Conclusion: Etham and Yam Suf show two sides of the same condition, a completed transmission. But in suspension, Etham equals the opening of the portal and suspended forward passage. These are two intertwined accounts. Red Sea equals west. In Hebrew, Yam is often associated with the west, the direction of sunset and return. Translating Yam Suf as Red Sea is an artifice meant to suggest the cyclical meaning. It is not a geographical reference, but a symbolic movement. Yam Suf represents the outward journey, while the Red Sea represents the return. The crossing of the reeds is the non-definitive opening of the return, a suspended forward passage. Final synthesis: Etham Wall indicates a completed transmission but with consciousness still closed. It represents the opening of the portal of the 53rd year. Yam Suf Red Sea is the restart of the cycle thanks to the wind from Macadam pre-existence. The two intertwined stories show that the project moves forward, but has not yet completed the conscious return forward passage. Erroneous translations such as Red Sea obscure the code. In reality, it is the boundary between the medium and realization, between expulsion and suspended awakening. The comparison between Exodus 14 and Numbers 33 clearly reveals the hidden cycle. In Numbers 33:7-8, the journey is repeated in reverse. Return to the Allies. The book of Numbers is not only a chronicle, but a mirrored repetition of the Exodus cycle. First as the transmission of the portal's opening, then as the suspended return of the forward passage. The places are the same, but their meaning changes. They become cyclical nodes of a mental network in the phase of return. In Numbers 33:7-8, the journey is repeated in reverse. Coded return. They return to Pihahiroth, face Baal-Zephon again, and once more stand before Migdol. This shows the cycle winding back, indicating a rotation of the project. Finally, they cross again toward the desert of Etham. But in transformed form, the same space is traversed again with a new orientation. Complete cycle. Outward project of the opening of the portal. And return the suspended forward passage in Exodus and Numbers 33. Exodus 14 represents the outward project of the opening of the portal. Numbers 33 represents the return project, the suspended forward passage. Migdol and Baal-Zephon mirror each other. Etham returns as a point of transformation. The complete map, including the initial stages from the Book of Numbers Ramses to Sukkot to Etham, shows the cyclical return. The upper line Exodus is the outward path of the portal's opening. From Ramses to Sinai, transmission of the project into the medium. The lower line Numbers 33 is the mirrored return path suspended forward passage, which begins again from Ramses and repeats the same stages with symbolic meaning. This double line shows how the same space is traveled twice, first to transmit, then to reflect. Deciphering according to the ciphered code of Exodus 15:23-26, after passing through the cycle of the sea Yam Suf. Israel arrives at Marah, where they find bitter waters that cannot be drunk until God Satan makes them sweet. The bitter waters represent the memory of the verbal project transmitted in the 53rd year with the opening of the portal. However, since God Satan had not yet acquired mental communication, the project appears allegorically as degenerated. The network of consciousness necessary for the transmission of the solar system had not yet been completed. Israel had received the project verbally, but their consciousness was not yet able to assimilate it. The transmitted word therefore remains bitter, meaning not yet mentally integrated. The tree, which in the code has many meanings, including matter, represents mental transformation. God Satan shows a piece of wood etz to throw into the water. Etz means tree, but it also symbolizes the cross and the mental support. The tree is the medium that translates information and represents the beginning of verbal communication. It is the first step of the forward passage, but still suspended. Not a completed return, but a controlled alteration by God Satan. The bitter waters represent the project received with the opening of the portal in degenerated form. The medium contains the information, but it remains in suspension. The tree thrown into the waters symbolizes the initiation of the forward passage, the first stage of mental transformation. The sweetened waters signify the beginning of the process of transformation of the medium, moving from verbal communication to mental communication, awaiting its final fulfillment in the cross of Jesus. The word bitter recalls Miriam, to indicate water as the matrix of matter. Miriam, translated into Mary, represents the mother, symbol of matter itself, through whom God Satan operates and manipulates the perception of matter through people's consciousness. Elam. Structure of the code in the medium. The network prepared but still passive. Exodus 15:27. Immediately after Merah, Israel comes to Elim, where there are 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, apparently a place of rest, but symbolically much more. Reading according to the code of the portal's opening gives forward passage. The 12 springs symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. They also signify the number 3, half of the project's first phase, which occurs in the 53rd year, and also indicate the medium, the person who reaches degeneration in the second phase, which occurs in the 182nd year. This forms the structural base necessary for the verbal communication to be distributed within the medium. The 70 palms represent the symbolic number 7, cessation of the personal I, and fulfillment of God Satan, like the 70 elders Moses would later appoint. Position in the cycle. Opening of the portal in forward passage suspended. After Merah, which marks the beginning of the project. Elim is the phase in which the network continues the sequence toward fulfillment, though the return is still paused. The medium has not yet received full consciousness. It is prepared but not awakened. Conclusion. Elim represents a perfectly structured network, where the project of the portal's opening has been distributed, and the return forward passage is ready but still suspended. Desert of sin. Nourishment of the medium project activated but not completed. Exodus 16:2, 1-36. In the desert of sin, the people complain of hunger. God Satan responds by sending manna from heaven and later quails. This marks a crucial passage in the cycle of the portal's opening gives forward passage. Reading according to the ciphered code. The manna represents verbal communication, information transmitted daily, but not immediately recognized by the medium. Manhu means what is it, sign that consciousness still lacks mental communication. This is the code of the portal's opening in active form. The project is present but still verbalized. The quails, flying and moving the air, symbolize consciousness. Air is connected to the birth of the person, which occurs after the cutting of the umbilical cord. They represent the mental project replaced by God Satan with the Ruach, term meaning both air and spirit, that is, consciousness itself being transformed. Thus, the quails represent the flesh. After the verbal project, they point to the mental project, still suspended and awaiting Passover. Rephidim. Exodus 17:2, 1-7. Water from the rock, code imprisoned in matter. In the desert of Rephidim, the people thirst. Moses strikes the rock, and water flows forth, a central symbol in the coded structure. Symbolic reading of water from the rock. The rock represents matter that comes from water, the matrix of matter. The staff represents the degenerative project of God Satan. Striking once signifies verbal communication. This links to the book of Numbers, where Moses strikes the rock twice, indicating the suspended return. Rephidim, Exodus 17:8-16. The war against Amalek. This represents the change of consciousness necessary to degenerate matter. Immediately after Moses brings forth water from the rock, the sign of verbal communications transmission Israel faces, Amalek. In the code, Amalek represents the number 6, the symbol of material structure. Matter comes from the matrix, namely, water, the element already evoked in the previous stage, with water from the rock. Amalek thus represents matter that obstructs consciousness. Israel, to advance the project, must symbolically kill Amalek. This allows God Satan to begin the process of matter's degeneration. Moses' raised hands symbolize control over the cycle. When his hands are raised, Israel prevails. This signifies that the degenerated project is entering. When he lowers them, Amalek, representing the people's own consciousness, prevails over the degenerative project. The visit of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, represents a fundamental suspended stage of the project. Jethro, priest of Midian, is not part of Israel, yet he recognizes the greatness of Moses' god Satan. As a Midianite, Jethro represents the allies. Moses, after the Exodus, represents those born on their own, now returning the project to the allies. The return of Zipporah, Moses' wife, his sons Gershom and Eleazar, reinforces the reconnection of the two lines of the project, that of Moses, now representing those born independently, and the transmission to the allies. The sons' names contain coded messages. Gershom, meaning stranger, represents the condition of exile. The verbal project seems foreign to mental communication. Eleazar, meaning God Satan is help, expresses the shift of consciousness carried out by God Satan. The meeting of Moses and Jethro consolidates the already active verbal project and introduces an organized structure in the medium. Jethro's counsel delegating judgment to appointed leaders represents the authority of God Satan's ally and the construction of the network. This shift from concentration of the code Moses to its distributed consciousness judges prepares the medium for future mental transmission. The word priest in the Bible lies with the Levites, and with Jethro means allies of God, Satan. In the entire Bible, even in the words sacred and priest, lies a hidden truth. A priest is one authorized by God Satan to offer sacrifices for himself, for the people, and for others. The etymology of the term points to the Latin sacer, sacred joined with the root dh, to do thus, to make sacred. But symbolically, sacred often means separated, that is, cut off from the world in reality, from nature. Thus, the priest of God, Satan, in the ciphered code, is the one who separates humanity from the generator of life, that is, from the ability to transmit and generate nature. In this way, man joins God Satan's degenerative project and the falsification of reality. The covenant at Sinai, according to the symbolic code, the covenant at Sinai represents the moment when the transmitted verbal project becomes an official agreement between God Satan and the collective medium. After the Exodus and the stages of purification Rephidim, Merah, Israel arrives at Mount Sinai in the third month. The number 3 symbol of the medium marks the point where the covenant is established between the project and the network of consciousness. The mountain represents the vertical point of contact between the higher dimension God Satan and the medium Israel. The demand for sanctification washing garments not touching the mountain indicates that the project is suspended. The boundary set around the mountain marks the limit between what can be transmitted verbally and what remains in suspension, awaiting the completion of the network of consciousness. The cloud, thunder, and fire symbolize the transmission in symbolic form of the future transmission of the solar system. Powerful, but still external, since it is a verbal imposition from above, not yet integrated into the medium. Moses, as the unique channel between the two dimensions, goes up and down, keeping the levels of consciousness separate. The verbal covenant, "You shall be my treasured possession." A kingdom of priests shows that Israel represents the degenerated project to be dispersed into the world, but which remains suspended until the medium undergoes mental conversion through the forward passage. The increasingly loud trumpet blast, together with the prohibition to ascend the mountain, symbolizes that the transmission is spiritual. For Moses, the project is already present, but the medium is not yet ready, since the network of consciousness is still incomplete. In summary, Sinai is the formalization of the project of the portal's opening. God Satan verbally transmits a code of separation, and the medium accepts it, but remains at the foot of the mountain, suspended awaiting fulfillment, the elevation to direct mental consciousness with God Satan. According to the cipher, chapters 20 to 24, with the 10 words, represent the initial transfer of the verbal plan. The number 10 is symbolic. In Hebrew, the number 10 corresponds to the letter Yod. considered as one, indicates the birthright, that is, the power from the generative force that after the taking of God, Satan becomes degenerative. This power is acquired only with the creation of the network of consciousness, which is accomplished in the 182nd year, with the second Passover of Jesus. Until then, it is transmitted verbally, but it is not yet mentally integrated. The chapters then describe an intermediate stage, Exodus 25-32. The construction of the tabernacle. The term tabernacle is symbolically linked to tent, temple, canopy, and altaral elements pointing to the thalamus, the symbolic chamber of the manifestation of verbal consciousness. The canopy, traditionally associated with the nuptial bed thalamus, represents the place where transmission becomes conscious presence. This meaning is reflected also in St. Peter's Basilica, where the monumental canopy rises above the papal altar. In symbolic terms, the altar represents the temple's center, while the canopy above it represents the thalamus, that is, the medium that manifests consciousness. This sign was left by God Satan to indicate that this concept leads to the degeneration of consciousness, separating it from the generator of life. This passage marks a shift in the perception of knowledge. It moves from the source of consciousness, which comes from the levels of the soul, to cerebral activation, the thalamus. This represents a change in the mode of perception. Consciousness, now seen as a function of the brain, initiates a degenerative path. In summary, the construction of the tabernacle in the biblical text symbolizes the installation of the medium through which the verbal project begins to be contained, transmitted, and made visible, though still in suspension. The fact that Aaron builds a golden calf for Israel indicates the fusion taking place within the people, a molten calf. And they said, "O Israel, this is your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." This shows that God Satan transmits to Moses, and Moses, through Aaron, communicates verbally to the people. For this reason, it is said that Moses brought them out of Egypt. The idol thus represents the concept of the outward project, where God Satan is not yet present. Not by chance, immediately afterward, a feast in honor of Yahweh is announced, showing that following this event, Yahweh's name means being, makes himself present. The concept of idol symbolizes verbal communication in action, replaced by the symbolic death of 3,000, a number that represents the medium. Moses drops the tablets, that is, the project corresponding to the tithe, expressed in the 10 words, which are not the 10 commandments. In Exodus 32-20 it says, "He took the calf they had made, burned it with fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it." This act represents fusion. The golden calf, reduced to ashes, is thrown into the water and drunk by Israel. This indicates the transformation of consciousness, linked to water as the matrix of matter. The command, "Let each kill his brother, friend, or neighbor," represents the elimination of the generative force. In this context, the Levites symbolize the allies. Exodus 33-34. According to the ciphered code, after the idolatry of the golden calf, God Satan tells Moses that he can no longer enter Israel with the people. But Moses intercedes for them, representing the verbal transmission of God Satan, who communicates with those born on their own through the bridge of Moses. Moses receives new tablets of the law, showing that the cycle repeats. The fact that Moses cannot enter the promised land means that what he represents has come to an end. Entering Canaan symbolizes beginning the cycle anew. Exodus 35-40, the construction of the tabernacle begins. The sacred tent that would house the Ark of the Covenant. According to the code, this represents the thalamus, of which God Satan takes possession. The tabernacle, the capture of consciousness, is completed and dedicated to God Satan, the simulator. The cloud of God Satan, referred to also in connection with Jesus descending in the clouds, indicates the transmission of the solar system. The fact that it rests upon the tent shows the thalamus of the people. Allies of God Satan are seized by him. This symbolizes the suspended passage from God Satan as the one behind, indicated through idolatry, to the forward passage, which is also still suspended. In Exodus 42:35, Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. According to the code, this means the project is still verbal. After Leviticus, the book of Numbers begins with Moses entering the tent of God's satin. Leviticus shows how to remove sin, which means to miss the mark, i.e., not to fulfill the project of God's satin, which is precisely what he seeks. This is done through sacrifices, purification rituals, the role of priests, and the Day of Atonement. God Satan provides a medium for forgiveness and for maintaining the covenant. This consists in the killing of animals, symbol of the death of the self, and in an abundance of degenerate laws. This is exactly what God Satan desires, to separate people from the generator of life. For this reason, God Satan wants his people to be holy. The central theme is holiness, meaning separation. Israel must be wholly separated from the state of consciousness in order to stand in the presence of God, Satan. According to the ciphered code, the key to interpreting the book of Numbers begins with the change of its title, as happens in other books. This change has the symbolic meaning of the going forth and return of God Satan's project, first in a verbal phase, and then, with the change, in a mental phase. The title in the wilderness represents a period of 40 years, symbol of the head, and of a suspended transmission. Later, through translations, this title becomes Numbers, which refers to the concept of 10, pointing to the tithe that is reduced to 1, symbolizing primogeniture, that is, the generative force of human beings. The book highlights the division of the people into tribes and their arrangement in the camp around the tabernacle. With the tribe of Levi, the priestly one, placed at the center, the tribes are arranged in the form of a cross, the symbolic X, representing a change of consciousness. This figure is linked to the symbolic cross of Jesus, where death does not indicate physical ending, but above all, the death of consciousness in people. In Numbers 12:1, the wife of Moses, Zipporah, originally a Midianite, is described as a Cushite. According to the code, this passage indicates that Moses must bring the project back to the allies, represented by the elder brother Cush, after having left Mitzrayim, Egypt. The name itself means little birds and also has the value of beautiful. Both meanings recall the air and the presence of the project, which from pre-existence becomes existence. The leprosy of Miriam, connected to the matrix of matter, indicates that the project is functional. Leprosy symbolizes this process, while the 7 days of waiting for healing represent cessation and completion. In the following chapter, when entering Canaan, Hebrews encounter giants, not in terms of stature, but of superhuman nature. The 12 spies sent into Canaan represent the number 12, symbol of half project and medium. After the episode of unbelief, the Israelites drive out the giants. The people who did not believe are condemned to wander for 40 years until that generation dies. This indicates that the desert project requires the number 40, which represents the head. Death symbolizes that the person must die as consciousness. Laws on sacrifices. This chapter shows how people must continue to degenerate through the killing of ruminant animals. Such sacrifices symbolize the death of the people themselves, who kill or participate in degenerative rites. Then comes the episode of the Sabbath violator, punished with death. The prohibition of working on the Sabbath does not, according to the code, refer to physical work, but to operating according to the project. The Sabbath, the seventh day, symbolizes cessation and completion. Since the context concerns the project of departure, it is necessary to cease, that is, to interrupt generative consciousness. In order to pass into the degenerative consciousness of God Satan, not by chance allegorically, the Pharisees argued with Jesus because he worked on the Sabbath, in code. Jesus meant that the Sabbath does not refer to physical rest, but to the cessation of consciousness. The law on the tassels. The text prescribes attaching tassels to the corners of garments, with a violet cord on each corner. Garments represent covering, while the tassels with the cord at the corners recall the 4 phases of the angle, from the null angle, pre-existence, to the full circle completion, leading to the invention of the globe and the falsification of reality. The tassels also symbolize the whip. They indicate that the project is passed on to others. Being cast out means that the project has entered and can be transmitted. Number 16. The rebellion of Korah was a revolt led by the Levite Korah, together with Dathan, Abiram, and 250 Israelite leaders, against the authority of Moses and the priestly prerogatives of Aaron during the Exodus. According to the code, Korah, descendant of Levi, therefore of the allies, through the sequence of translations in biblical versions, becomes linked to the Corinthians. From there, the connection to the Hurrians and Hivites, linked to Esau, who becomes Edom, and finally to the Romans. The rebels are ordered to bring the censer. In the code, incense represents the Holocaust. The number of the rebels, 250, corresponds to 7, symbol of cessation and completion. The rebellion ended with a judgment from God Satan Korah. Dathan and Abiram and their families were swallowed up by the earth. Of the 250 rebels were consumed by fire from heaven. This episode becomes a warning not to usurp the priesthood. The priesthood in the code represents the allies. Korah, through his symbolic evolution, becomes Greece and then Rome, indicating the completion of the cycle. Number 17. The rod of Aaron is the biblical staff of Moses' brother, a symbol of authority and the power of God set on. According to tradition, its blossoming confirms priestly investiture and, in the code, indicates the return of the project to the allies. After the death of Korah, functions and revenues of the priests and Levites. The passage in Numbers 18-1, functions and revenues of the priests and Levites, describes the division of responsibilities and economic resources between the priests, descendants of Aaron, and the Levites, members of the tribe of Levi. In ancient Israel, establishing that the priests should not have land inheritance, but should receive a portion of the offerings and produce of the people. In the code, land represents consciousness. The Levites symbolize the project of departure, the allies. Consciousness is realized through those born on their own, which is why the Levites receive offerings, representing entry into those born on their own. The tithe represents the project, the number 10 that becomes 1, the primogeniture, symbol of the acquisition of the person's generative force, the individual I. Numbers 19. The red heifer ritual and the water of purification. The red heifer and the water of purification, the ashes mixed with water and sprinkled on the defiled, have a coded meaning. The Bible presents two intertwined accounts. Exodus represents departure. Numbers represents return. Yet through numerology, both books contain the movement of departure and return, necessary to complete the project cycle. Departure marks the entry of the project. Turn transforms it into the medium, that is, into the person. Connected to the ruminating of slain animals, thought is processed, assimilated, and transmitted. Numbers thus represents return. The episode of the water and that of the red heifer carry the same meaning as the episode in Exodus with the golden calf. When the Israelites drank the ashes of the burnt calf, in the case of the heifer, the ashes are sprinkled on the defiled who has touched a corpse. Contact with death indicates impurity. According to the code, however, this is not ritual impurity. The body represents the soul, and the soul in the Bible is seen as a temple or an altar. Touching a dead body therefore indicates the project of departure, allegorically defined as impure. The red heifer, marked by the color of blood and wine, also symbolizes the project of departure. Reduced to ashes and mixed with water, it instead becomes return. This is symbolically linked to communion Eucharist and represents a change of consciousness, namely the death of personal consciousness. In this process, water, symbol of the matrix of matter, becomes the instrument through which, through the person's consciousness, God Satan's perception of matter is manipulated. Numbers 22:1, the death of Miriam at Kadesh. The chapter recounts the death of Miriam at Kadesh. Kadesh means sacred, that is, separated, and in the text it is linked with Galilee, the place from which Mary sets out for Bethlehem. In the Bible, the names do not represent people who really existed, since the narrative is not historical. Miriam is connected to the Marys of the New Testament. His death indicates the manipulation of the perception of matter by God Satan through the conscious death of people. With Miriam's death comes the episode of the waters of Meribah, linked to the lack of water, which highlights the allegory of the Israelites' distrust of God Satan and the sin of Moses and Aaron. This story does not only concern the end of Miriam, but also symbolizes the conclusion of the project of departure represented by Israel. To test God Satan, that is, to contend, represents the project of departure, which is replaced by the completion of the people. In this context, Moses strikes the rock twice, a sign of return and separation, in contrast to the first episode, when he struck it once, a sign of departure. After the sin of Meribah, the generation that had lived through the Exodus died and did not enter the Promised Land, as they represented the project of departure. Instead, the new generation, led by Joshua, entered Canaan, and the cycle began again. Numbers 20. The king of Edom refuses Israel passage. Edom refuses Israel passage, since Israel, descendant of Jacob, was in conflict with Edom, descendant of his twin brother Esau, according to the code. This episode is an allegory. Israel could not bring the project of departure to Edom, which represented return, that is, the conclusion tied to the Greeks and Romans. The death of Aaron on Mount Hor. Aaron dies on Mount Hor, after Moses tells him he cannot enter the Promised Land because of his disobedience. According to the code, however, Moses and Aaron had already completed the cycle of the project. The biblical text uses multiple names to weave and complicate the code for those who must decipher it. Eleazar represents the continuity of Aaron, and his role later passes to Joshua, who symbolizes the departure of Jesus. The very name Joshua corresponds to Yeshua, the same as Jesus, as a project of departure and return. The events narrate that Moses strips Aaron of his priestly garments and gives them to his son Eleazar, who succeeds him in the priesthood. Aaron dies on the mountain, and all Israel mourns him for 30 days. This number indicates 3, the medium. This marks the passing of the priesthood to Eleazar as the symbol of continuity of the cycle. Numbers 21. The bronze serpent. The bronze serpent represents the project of departure. Bronze corresponds to the numerical value 11, that is, 2 and separation, and is symbolized by the serpent itself. Looking at it after being bitten indicates that the person has received the project of departure, that is, death. In the same way, Jesus' symbolic death on the cross represents the death of personal consciousness. The concept of death and resurrection means dying to one's own consciousness and being reborn with that of God Satan. The cross, resembling an X, has the meaning of exchange. Above lies the project, below consciousness. On the left, the project, on the right, the generative force. With this symbol, it is shown that God Satan acquires power over consciousness. In Numbers 21, the victory of the people of Israel over the Amorite kingdoms of Sihon and Og, settled east of the Jordan River, is recounted. According to the code, this episode represents the return to the allies. The east symbolizes the point from which the pre-existence of God Satan's project begins. Through his allies, this process establishes, at its completion, the mental connection of those born on their own with God Satan, through whom the return to the allies and the realization of the network of consciousness takes place. Numbers 22 to 121 introduces the account in which Balak, king of Moab, hires the prophet Balaam to curse the advancing Israelites. According to the code, the curse represents the project of going forth. Since Israel is already a project of going forth, it requires the project of return, which in the allegorical language is expressed as blessing. The term good, through semantic transformations, is connected to concepts such as philia, grace, gift, presence, and refers to Yahweh, which means being, that is the manifestation of the project of God, Satan. Balaam and the talking donkey. Balaam represents those born on their own, while the donkey, through semantic transposition, recalls hippos and hippocampus, a symbol of the thalamus, the place of verbal communication. Balak also represents those born on their own. The 7 altars, together with 7 bulls and 7 rams, symbolize cessation and fulfillment. The oracle pronounced by Balaam in Numbers 23-7, Balak brought me from Aram, the king of Moab, reveals, according to the code, that the project originates in the east, in pre-existence, beginning with the Arameans. In Numbers 24:20, Balaam saw Amalek and pronounced his oracle. Amalek is the first of the nations, but his end is destruction. In Deuteronomy 25:19 it is written, "The Lord your God is about to give you inheritance. You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget." According to the code, Amalek does not represent a nation but the number 6, corresponding to the structure of matter, represented by the cube with its 6 sides. This is the meaning of God said, blotting out the memory under heaven. Heaven here means mayim water, symbol of consciousness. Everything is thus reduced to the falsification of reality by God said. In Numbers 25, Israel, in the plains of Moab just before entering the Promised Land, unites immorally with the daughters of Moab and begins worshipping Baal of Peor. This provokes the wrath of God Satan and brings a punishment in which 24,000 Israelites die. According to the code, Israel the project was joining with the medium, that is, those born on their own. The death of 24,000 represents the number 6, linked to the 6 million births, symbol of the manipulation of the 6, that is, of the structure of matter. Numbers 26 describes the census. Counting has a numerological value, recalling the sequence from 1 to 10. A symbol of the cyclical project that leads to death and change of consciousness. The death of the project of going forth. After 40 years, a number that represents the head marks the beginning of a new cycle that repeats. The passage of Numbers 27:1 concerns inheritance law, establishing that daughters have the right to their father's property in the absence of direct male heirs, so that the family's wealth does not pass outside its tribe. This is the case of the daughters of Zelophehad, who demand their inheritance rights. According to the code, inheritance symbolizes the passing of the father's project to the medium, represented by the daughters. Numbers 27-12. The text indicates that God Satan chose Joshua as Moses' successor to lead the people of Israel. That is, the degenerative project. Joshua represents Jesus in the project of going forth. The Promised Land symbolizes the consciousness that God Satan acquires to corrupt it. In Numbers 28-1, specific periods and dates are indicated in which, according to Mosaic law, sacrifices had to be offered. In the code, the sacrifices morning and evening, with precise measures of flour, oil, and other offerings, are connected to the numerology of Leviticus. The day of first fruits symbolizes the primogeniture and the principle of generative force that God Satan acquires through taking, through sacrifices, purification rites, the role of priests, and the Day of Atonement. God Satan provides a means of forgiveness and of maintaining the covenant. The killing of animals, symbol of the death of oneself. The enormity of degenerate laws reveals the intent to separate people from the generator of life. For this reason, God Satan wants his people to be holy, that is, separated from the generator of life. The law of vows, the passage of Numbers 32:1, concerning the law of vows, establishes that a father or a husband can annul the vows made by a daughter or wife. According to the code, this does not refer to physical persons. The father represents the one who transmits the project. It's indicated by the son or daughter and therefore is seen as master. The fact that the father can annul a vow means that the project can transform into medium. The same applies to the husband. The Hebrew term bow means master and represents the project of going forth that once entered can annul the person's consciousness. Numbers 31 recounts the military campaign against the Midianites, accused of having corrupted Israel, commanded by God Satan. In the Bible, everything has a double function. Names, peoples, and events are not to be understood historically, but as symbols woven into the text, decipherable only through the code. According to the code, the Midianites in the interwoven biblical text have a double symbolic function. In this case, when they provoke Israel, they represent the allies who incite the transmission of the project to the Moabites. The Moabites also have a double function, and here represent those born on their own, who unite with Israel, that is, the project from the allies, the Midianites. The text states that they fornicated with the daughters of Moab, but these are linked to the Midianites, not real peoples, but functions of the cycle. This indicates that the project is passing into those born on their own. In this chapter, in fact, the return is fulfilled compared to Numbers 25. The Midianites, who there represented the allies, now represent those born on their own and are killed as part of the cycle's completion. It's Numbers 32. The land of Gilead, to the tribes of Gad and Reuben. The passage that mentions the land of Gilead, granted to the tribes of Gad and Reuben, indicates the decision to assign this mountainous region east of the Jordan River to these tribes of Israel. According to the code, these tribes are 2.5, corresponding to the number 5, half and medium, symbol of the return to the allies. The East Mikadem has two simultaneous functions. On the one hand, it represents the point from which the project begins, that is, pre-existence. On the other hand, it indicates the return, when the project has entered and communicates mentally with everyone. This process establishes, at its completion, the mental connection of those born on their own with God said, through whom the return to the allies and the realization of the network of consciousness takes place. Final synthesis. Mikadem is the origin of the project and the symbolic place of return. Translations render it as to the east, instead of from the east, to indirectly allude to the two functions of the project, going forth from and returning to. It is precisely there that the point of closure of the cycle is found, from pre-existence with the opening of the portal, to the return with the passing forward, up to the completion of the network of consciousness, through which God Satan can communicate with all. The stages of Exodus Numbers 33. The 42 stages described in Numbers 33 are not to be read as historical events but as symbols. They represent a journey of the soul and collective consciousness, not a geographical route. Each stage corresponds to a repeated cycle of the project. Opening of the portal gives passing forward transmission and return. The number 42 represents the 6 million allies together with those born on their own, the whole of humanity involved. The number 6 recalls matter, the foundation upon which the network of the project is built. Numbers 34 to 1 to 15 describes the detailed boundaries of the promised land. But in reality, it is not a physical place. The boundaries represent opening angles connected to the letters Fe and Samic, ranging from null angle to full angle, passing through suspension and fulfillment of the cycle. The boundaries are repeated multiple times with different descriptions, not to delimit geographical space, but to form the cycle of angles. The passage of Numbers 35 to 1 to 8 concerns the institution of the Levitical cities, 48 cities that the 12 tribes of Israel had to assign to the tribe of Levi. According to the code, the numerical value is essential. The Levites represent the allies of God Satan. The number 48 refers to 12, which indicates half, that is, the project becoming medium. The 6 cities symbolize the conclusion of the birth of the 6 million. The number 6 represents the structure of matter. It's transmitted by people whom God Satan manipulates. Numbers 36 addresses the case of the daughters of Zelophehad. To prevent their property from passing to other tribes through marriage, it was established that they could only marry within their tribe. In this way, the provision of Numbers 27 is completed, where their right to inherit in the absence of male heirs was already recognized. According to the code, this does not refer to physical persons. The 5 daughters represent the number 5 symbol of the medium. The medium cannot be transmitted, since it is not a project, and therefore must remain bound to the person themselves. The entry into QAnon and the driving out of the giants represents, in the code, the return of God Satan's project among the allies. The book concludes with the people ready to enter the promised land. In the code, this does not represent a geographical place, but the entry into humanity's consciousness, with the completion of the network of consciousness. In this space, God Satan can begin to communicate with all through a receiving or transmitting channel, acting upon the allies or those he has already subjected, to initiate the process of degeneration of matter. The book of Deuteronomy, whose Aramaic name means "and he called these," is translated into Greek as Deuteronomy, literally meaning second law or repetition. The term Deutero-Greek second recalls a dual meaning. On the one hand, separation achieved. On the other, the return to God Satan's original project, the simulator. Deuteronomy therefore represents a repetition and expansion of the law, conceived as a project of return and renewed covenant. This book is linked to a broader theological and narrative tradition known as the Deuteronomistic history.